One of the things that makes G.I. Joe so fascinating and compelling is that it has a fantastic villain in Cobra. And Cobra is very different in different versions of the G.I. Joe medium. For example, it's very different from the cartoon when you read the comic books from the original 80s run. So in this video, I'm going to talk about a few comic book Cobra characters that I think are more complex or interesting than their cartoon counterparts. Hi, I'm Christopher, aka the Bronze Age Nerd, and welcome to another video. In this one, we're going to be exploring some Cobra characters that deserve a moment in the spotlight when you look at their comic book appearances. First up on the list, we're going to talk about some people's absolute favorite character from G.I. Joe, and that is Storm Shadow. Storm Shadow is a fan favorite for sure. The figure, the character in the cartoon, and the character in the comics are all extremely popular. You can extend that to the live action movies as well, because he's probably the most interesting part about the most recent Snake Eyes film. But while Storm Shadow is a very cool character in the cartoon series, he's a little two-dimensional. In the comic books, I think he's a little bit more fleshed out. In the comic book series written by Larry Hama, Storm Shadow is Tommy Arashikage. And he even serves alongside Snake Eyes and Stalker, as well as 3 other soldiers, as part of a recon patrol. After a narrow escape, Storm Shadow ends up having to save Snake Eyes because Stalker believes that Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow are dead. And later after the war, you find out that Storm Shadow is actually part of a ninja clan. And this clan is led by the Hard Master and the Soft Master, and get your minds out of the gutter. So Snake Eyes later joins this clan, and there's a rivalry that forms between the two because Snake Eyes is a better student in many ways. However, Storm Shadow still excels as being an excellent archer and a formidable foe in his own right. Where things get complicated is that his uncle is killed while he's impersonating Snake Eyes in a fight with Snake Eyes. And this is an interesting moment in the comic books where you see some advanced training techniques involving sound being used, which is a running theme in Storm Shadow's existence ever since his first appearance in G.I. Joe 21, the infamous silent issue. And later on, spoiler alert here, we later learned that ZARTAN is the one who actually killed his uncle, but he did so disguised as Storm Shadow. And these events lead to Storm Shadow leaving the Arashikage clan and going and becoming an agent for Cobra. And the real reason why is fascinating. He wants to learn the real identity of the killer for his uncle to get his revenge and honor his family. So this character is much more complex than we see in the cartoon or in the figure's bio or any of these other things. This is a character who is doing something very complex. He has joined Cobra specifically with the hopes of avenging his uncle. Now, the reason he falls so short on this list is because even though he is a Cobra agent, he's a Cobra agent by necessity for his own purposes. In fact, I would argue that Storm Shadow throughout most of his adventures is really more of a lone agent, or eventually kind of working for G.I. Joe, essentially. But Storm Shadow has a very complex and cool history in the comic books, and is definitely worth reading in the series. Next up on the list, we're going to discuss ZARTAN. ZARTAN is another fan favorite character for many people, and the reasons are that he's kind of a badass. In both the comic books and the cartoon series, ZARTAN is the leader of the Dreadnoks. The Dreadnoks were a biker gang, essentially designed to be a little bit like a Mad Max sort of team that's out there doing, bad things for Cobra, kind of one of those sub-teams that Cobra has. A fun backstory about the Dreadnoks that ZARTAN forms is that originally Hasbro and Marvel wanted those characters to be essentially like Ewoks. Return of the Jedi was very popular at the time, and so the idea was to have some cute furry little creatures. Larry Hama famously told them, no, we're not going to do that, and turn them into a biker gang instead. And that was a really smart decision because it made for a very cool team of characters. And they are a very effective unit, although often portrayed as a little silly in the comic books. For example, they love drinking grape soda and chocolate-covered donuts. But despite that, ZARTAN is all business. So we've already discussed ZARTAN's kind of earliest adventure with Cobra, but a little more background on that is that ZARTAN was hired by Cobra to eliminate Snake Eyes. There's much more backstory with Cobra Commander and Snake Eyes that we'll talk about a little later in this video, but there are good reasons why Snake Eyes is wanted dead by Cobra Commander. But ZARTAN screws up. He was supposed to kill Snake Eyes, but since Storm Shadow's uncle was portraying Snake Eyes in a training exercise, he accidentally kills him instead. This leads to a chain of events that is going to set up a lot of stuff that happens in the comic books, and so Zartan is a pivotal character in that situation. Zartan goes on to have a lot of cool adventures in the comic books. Notably, he has a huge starring role in issue number 49, where he attempts to infiltrate the pit as a injured version of Ripcord with his Master of Disguise abilities, but of course he is found out by the Joes and defeated by Sergeant Slaughter. But in reality, Zartan's biggest event in the comic books after his introduction comes during the Cobra Island Civil War, which is a fantastic storyline. During this war, which ultimately led to the demise of Fred 7, who was impersonating Cobra Commander with the help of the Baroness, Zartan actually kills Serpentor. And this is one of the reasons why Zartan and Storm Shadow are both known as some of the best archers in all of the G.I. Joe continuity. Zartan is somebody who obviously tried to impersonate Storm Shadow and killed his uncle with a bow and arrow. But in this series of events, he takes out Serpentor, landing the killing blow to one of the main primary forces in the Cobra leadership and solidifying Cobra leadership behind Cobra Commander. Landing at the number 3 spot is Serpentor, who is a vastly more interesting character in the comic books than he is in the cartoon series. Serpentor is perhaps one of the most derisive characters in all of G.I. Joe. People either love him or hate him. He's very polarizing, but his appearances in the comic books do make a lot more sense. Much like in the cartoon, Serpentor is formed from the DNA of several important historical figures to create a super soldier and supreme leader for Cobra. There is one difference, and it's involving a character that we've mentioned already on this list. In the comic books, Storm Shadow's DNA is also used because he is considered one of the best soldiers in Cobra's army. So not only is Serpentor this historical figure mishmash, but he also has some of Cobra's elite soldiers' DNA in him as well. And again, just like in the cartoon, he is created by Dr. Mindbender in this crazy Frankenstein-esque sequence. However, in the comic book, Serpentor has more of a baptism of fire. He is raised in one of the Springfield towns, which is Cobra's secret town where they train an army of soldiers and hide in plain sight in America. Serpentor volunteers to lead a group of soldiers in a counterattack to help secure the town and proves an excellent leader. And Serpentor really shows his leadership here because he essentially knows that he is going to be in a power struggle with Cobra, and he starts to really try to flesh out his power by cementing himself as a key figure within Cobra's mythos, on purpose, which is a really smart move. As soon as he arrives on Cobra Island, he begins these tactics, and he eventually starts the Cobra Island Civil War to try to take power back and take it from Cobra. And this power dynamic, this shift, is definitely a departure from the TV series where Serpentor is created to be the leader and just sort of takes Cobra Commander's place. You have Cobra Commander constantly scheming to try to take over power back from Serpentor. But in the comic books, it's a little bit more of a meritocracy where Serpentor shows his value and worth and earns a place among Cobra's top leadership. And then that's where the power struggle between Serpentor and Cobra Commander takes place. After a failed attack on the pit, Cobra Commander is presumed dead, and Serpentor is able to take charge of Cobra. He makes some shrewd moves. He sells off terradromes to third parties. He establishes a consulate in New York to allow Cobra to operate with impunity, and also to deal in some backdoor dealings. But he does make mistakes as well, such as replacing the Baroness with Zarana. This forms a rift in the core leadership of Cobra. You have to keep in mind that Cobra is originally a triumvirate controlled by Cobra Commander, Destro, and the Baroness. So when Fred 7 shows up and impersonates Cobra Commander, Baroness is inclined to take his position, even though she knows he is an imposter. And this is where Serpentor really starts to falter, because this is the impetus that leads to that infamous Cobra Island Civil War. And as we mentioned earlier in the video, Serpentor is eventually killed by Zartan during this conflict after capturing the Baroness and riding around with her as a human shield on front of his tank, which, by the way, is one of my favorite comic book covers of all time, and an awesome moment from this event. And this brings us to Baroness. See how all these characters are connected and how awesome they are? And that is something that is much more cohesive in the comic books in general, is the interconnection between characters. Of course, there's a lot more time to tell stories, so that definitely helps. But the Baroness has been influential throughout all these events that we've mentioned so far. She's been a main character, and she's also one of the 3 leaders of Cobra at the beginning of the storyline, which takes us all the way back to G.I. Joe #1 and the Baroness's first appearance in the comic books. and she is literally the first face of Cobra we see. When Cobra reveals itself to the world, she is the one that is responsible for the actions as she is attacking a train where there is a scientist on board named Dr. Adele Burkhart. This is the event that led to the conflict between G.I. Joe and Cobra, as G.I. Joe is then dispatched to rescue Dr. Burkhart. And this is a complex situation. Dr. Burkhart was originally speaking out against the military, and she is part of the creator of a doomsday device, which is why Cobra wants her. But there's more complexity and detail to this situation than you would find in most of the cartoon plots. But you can't deny that the Baroness was at the very start of the conflict that led to G.I. Joe versus Cobra in the first place. So if you like anything about G.I. Joe's conflict with Cobra, you have the Baroness to thank. Before we get to our final pick, I want to make one honorable mention. You can't talk about villains in the G.I. Joe comic book series without talking about Quinn. Quinn is a mercenary, which is why he doesn't land officially on this list, but he does work for Cobra at one point during the comic book series. We first meet Quinn in issue number 2, where he is working for the Russians to help secure some technology. This battle in the Arctic is complicated and involves a lot of different maneuvering as the G.I. Joe team tries to rescue the technology and the records that Quinn stole. But Quinn is a formidable foe. Not only is he a highly capable character who's worked for agencies like the CIA and MI6, he is a very formidable fighter that ends up taking on the G.I. Joe team several times and easily defeating them when he's required to, even when he's outnumbered. But Quinn is a man of honor. He has a strict honor code, and several times we see him help the Joes when he finds out that they are not the ones that are his enemies, or that they are somebody that he needs to work with to get through the situation that he's in. But he is unfaltering in his loyalty to his contract, and he will find a way to complete his mission even if he believes that they are the wrong side, and yet he still finds a way to do this in an honorable fashion. It's a shame that Quinn was not a more integral part of the cartoon or other G.I. Joe media, but he is a fantastic element to the comic book series. This leads us to the number 1 spot, and it could be only one character. At the heart of Cobra is Cobra Commander. Cobra Commander in the TV series is a sniveling, whining fool who is often played for laughs. Cobra Commander in the comic book definitely has more layers to him, and he is definitely a more formidable foe. The earliest thing we know about Cobra Commander in the comic book series is that his brother is involved in a drunk driving car accident. So during this time, Cobra Commander is working as a used car salesman. Now, a lot of people point to this being his origin story, but as Hooded Cobra Commander 788 points out, this is not really the true origin of Cobra Commander. Yes, he was a used car salesman, but that's not all he was. He later would become a businessman and a schemer, deceiving people and running pyramid schemes, and that's where he got the funding to start Cobra. One of the driving forces behind Cobra Commander is that earlier in life, his brother was drunk driving and killed in an accident that also took the members of another family in another car, save for one child who ends up becoming Snake Eyes. Cobra Commander is obsessed with Snake Eyes, and that's what leads to him trying to be killed, which basically starts an entire chain of events that is absolutely fundamental to the story of G.I. Joe. But it also makes his motivations make a little bit more sense. They're a little bit more logical. He's also a much more capable commander in the comic books, although not necessarily a military genius, but Cobra Commander often proves to be cagey and a worthy foe for G.I. Joe. In the comic books, we learn that Cobra is a much more secretive organization until that event with the Baroness trying to kidnap Dr. Burkhart. And this is ultimately what drives the conflict with Cobra and G.I. Joe and what puts them on the world stage. They hadn't really intended to do that, but they were forced into that position. But the Cobra Commander of the comic books does things that are a lot more intelligent. For example, the creation of Springfield is a really brilliant plan. This town hiding in plain sight that trains Cobra forces that's completely loyal to Cobra. He masterminds several attacks on the Pit, which is the G.I. Joe headquarters in the comic books. Now, they aren't successful, but they are devious plans that could have easily succeeded if it hadn't been for the craftiness of the G.I. Joe team. And in the comics, it's Cobra Commander that orders the creation of Serpentor himself. It's a very smart plan to create this super warrior. If it hadn't been for Dr. Mindbender's meddling, he probably would have created a very awesome super soldier, but because of Dr. Mindbender's creation, he ends up becoming somebody who's going to become more of a leader. And while Cobra Commander's side loses the Cobra Island Civil War, you can't actually blame the real Cobra Commander for that because it wasn't really him. It was Fred Seven impersonating him. During this time, the real Cobra Commander is not active and is presumed dead. There is a massive plot line with Cobra Commander's son, Billy, which is an integral part of the story as well. And while I wouldn't say the events make Cobra Commander a very likable character and his relationship with his son isn't a healthy one, it does add, again, an extra dimension to his life. He's formerly was a family man, he had a wife, and he had his son that he does obviously care for. And all of this makes Cobra Commander a much more serious character. And not only that, a more understandable one, which makes for a much better villain and antagonist to the G.I. Joe team. Alright, that was my list of characters I think that had a much more impact in the comic books than they did in the cartoon, and were better for it. Let me know what you think about some of these characters down below in the comments. This video is part of a collaboration called Cobra Convergence 7. Cobra Convergence is the takeover month where a lot of G.I. Joe content creators focus on content regarding Cobra instead of G.I. Joe for the month of July. If you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend checking out other entries in the Cobra Convergence 7 calendar this month. You can find details on that on hcc788.com. Lastly, I want to thank all of my channel members whose names are scrolling by on the screen. They are a huge help to my production of this channel, and they deserve a shout out at the end of every video. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Until then, I want to remind you, as always, hey, 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 hey. Read comics every day.